fire had not yet come. The house still stood, its walls heavy with silence and the weight of too many years. Rain drummed against the windows of the rectory, a steady rhythm that had become familiar to those who dwelt within its rooms. It was late evening in the summer of 1929, and the Reverend's wife stood at the landing of the main staircase, her hand pressed against the cold wood of the banister. She had heard it again, the footsteps in the corridor above, measured and deliberate, though she knew no one walked there. The candle in her hand trembled, its flame casting long shadows across the wallpaper, patterns of roses that seemed to twist in the flickering light. Below, in the study, her husband sat with his books, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what had become undeniable. The rectory breathed around them, settling into the damp earth of the Suffolk marshlands, and somewhere in the gardens, beneath the ancient yew trees, something moved in the darkness. The locals had spoken of this place for generations, whispered of the nun who walked the lawn at twilight, of lights that appeared in empty rooms, of a coach drawn by headless horses that clattered down the drive when the moon was dark. But the living had always dismissed such tales until they came to dwell within these walls themselves. The house waited, as it had always waited, patient in its gathering of stories, of grief, of the strange communion between the dead and those who refused to believe. Chapter 1. The Rectory on the Marshlands. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has drawn its curtain across the world, and somewhere in the quiet hours you have found your way here. Perhaps you listen from beneath warm covers or in a chair by a window where the darkness presses close. Whatever the hour, wherever you rest, know that you are welcome. Before sleep claims you, let us journey together into the past, into those shadowed corners of history where the veil between worlds grows thin. If you find comfort in these tales, consider subscribing to this channel. Your support breathes life into these forgotten stories, allowing them to be told again and again. Share this video with those who seek such narratives in the stillness of night, for it helps us grow and continue this work. Now, let the present fade. Let us drift backward through the years, cross the English countryside, to a place where the marshlands meet the sky, where a house once stood that would become known throughout the world. Close your eyes if you wish. The story begins. The land had been holy once. In the 12th century, Benedictine monks had walked the grounds that would one day bear the weight of Borley Rectory, their sandalled feet marking paths through the Suffolk marshes. They had built a monastery there, choosing the site for its isolation, its proximity to the River Stour, and perhaps for reasons known only to those who sought communion with the divine in places remote from this world of men. The monastery had endured for centuries, a place of prayer and contemplation, until the dissolution swept across England in the 16th century. King Henry VIII's commissioners came with their ledgers and their authority, disbanding the religious houses, scattering the monks, claiming the land and properties for the crown. The monastery at Borley was pulled down, its stones carried away, its chapels emptied of their holy relics. The land returned to agriculture, to the slow cycle of seasons, to the farmers who work the heavy clay soil. But legend claimed the ground remembered. The local people, dwelling in the scattered cottages and farms around Borley village, spoke of a tale that had roots deeper than memory could reach. They told of a monk and a nun from nearby convents who had fallen into forbidden love, their hearts betraying their vows. The story varied in its telling. Some said the nun came from a convent at Bures. Others suggested she belonged to a different order entirely, but the essence remained constant. The lovers had planned to flee together, to abandon their religious life and seek a future beyond the reach of ecclesiastical authority. They arranged to meet in secret, the monk securing a carriage to carry them away into the night. But their plan had been discovered. The versions diverged here as well. Some said the nun was caught and returned to her convent, where she was bricked up alive within the walls as punishment for her transgression. Others claimed the monk was executed, beheaded for his betrayal of his sacred vows, while the nun was condemned to walk the earth eternally, searching for her lost love. Still others whispered that both lovers met a terrible end, their bodies buried in unhallowed ground, denied the comfort of Christian burial. Whether the tale held truth or merely the poetry of folklore, the people of Borley believed it. They claimed to have seen the nun walking at dusk along the path that would later be called the Nun's Walk, a spectral figure in grey or black habit, her face obscured by a veil, moving silently across the grounds where the monastery had once stood. Some reported seeing her on certain days of the year, particularly around the anniversary dates that local tradition had assigned to the tragedy. The sightings were numerous enough, consistent enough across generations, that the legend became woven into the fabric of the place itself. In the year 1862, the Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull came to Borley as the new rector. The previous rectory had been a modest structure, insufficient for a clergyman with a large family and ambitions befitting his station. Reverend Bull commissioned the construction of a new rectory, a substantial building that would reflect both his position and his needs. The architect designed a red brick structure in the Victorian style, large and rambling, with numerous rooms spread across multiple floors. The house rose on the very grounds where the monastery had stood centuries before, built perhaps upon the foundations of the old religious buildings, or at least in close proximity to where they had been. The rectory was completed in 1863, an imposing presence in the flat landscape of the Suffolk marshlands. It stood 3 stories high, not counting the cellars that extended beneath the structure, dug deep into the earth. The red bricks seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, giving the building a sombre appearance even on bright days. Gothic revival details adorned the structure, pointed arch windows, decorative brickwork, steep gabled roofs. A bell tower rose from one section, visible for miles across the fields. The grounds included a garden, a lawn that stretched toward the lane, and the path that locals still called the Nun's Walk, lined with trees that had perhaps stood since the monastery days. Reverend Bull moved into the rectory with his wife and their 14 children. The house, despite its size, must have filled quickly with the noise and movement of such a large family. The children ranged in age from infants to young adults, and the rectory became a place of life and activity, of lessons and prayers, of meals taken in the large dining room and evenings spent in the drawing room. Servants attended to the household, maintaining the many rooms, preparing meals, tending to the fires that heated the cold spaces during winter months. But the house carried something else within its walls, something that made itself known almost from the beginning. The Bull family, devout and practical as they were, began to experience occurrences that defied rational explanation. The first incidents were subtle, the sound of footsteps in corridors when no one walked there, doors that opened or closed of their own accord, cold spots that appeared in certain rooms regardless of the season or the heat from the fireplaces. The children reported seeing figures that vanished when approached, hearing whispers in empty chambers, feeling unseen presences watching from darkened doorways. Reverend Bull himself witnessed the phantom nun. On a summer evening, as twilight settled across the marshlands, he stood at a window overlooking the lawn and saw her, a woman in dark religious habit walking slowly along the path beneath the trees. He called to others in the household, and they too saw the figure, moving with steady purpose across the grounds. Some of the family rushed outside, attempting to approach the apparition, to speak to her or determine who she might be. But as they drew near, the figure seemed to fade, becoming less substantial until she vanished entirely, leaving only the empty path and the swaying branches overhead. The sighting was not singular. The nun appeared again and again through the years of Reverend Bull's tenure at Borley. She was seen at twilight most often, though some claimed to have witnessed her in full daylight or in the deep darkness of moonless nights. She always followed the same route, walking the path that bore her name, never deviating, never acknowledging those who watched her. Her face remained hidden behind a veil or simply obscured by shadow, and no sound accompanied her passage, no rustle of fabric, no footfall on earth or gravel. She was there, and then she was not, as though she belonged to some other dimension that occasionally intersected with the visible world. Other phenomena accumulated as the years passed. A phantom coach was reported, drawn by headless horses, clattering up the drive to the rectory in the hours before dawn. Witnesses described hearing the sound of hooves and wheels on gravel, the jingle of harness, But when they looked from windows or ventured outside, they saw nothing, only heard the sounds receding into the distance as though the coach had continued on its spectral journey. Bells rang in empty rooms. The sound of organ music drifted through the house when the instrument in the drawing room stood untouched. Servants reported being touched by invisible hands, feeling fingers grasp their shoulders or arms when they worked alone in certain parts of the house. The cellars proved particularly unsettling. The underground chambers extended beneath much of the structure, their floors of flagstone, their walls of brick and mortar. These spaces were used for storage, coal for the fires, preserved foods, wine, the various supplies required for running a large household. But those who descended into the cellars often reported feeling watched, experiencing sudden drops in temperature, hearing sounds that had no source. Some refused to go below alone, insisting on companionship even for brief errands to fetch coal or retrieve stored items. Reverend Bull appeared undisturbed by the phenomena, or at least unwilling to abandon the house because of them. He was a man of faith, educated at Cambridge, ordained in the Church of England, devoted to his pastoral duties. Perhaps he viewed the strange occurrences as tests of faith, or perhaps he simply accepted them as part of the character of the place, no more troubling than the damp that rose from the marshlands, or the winds that swept across the flat countryside. His children grew accustomed to the house's peculiarities, incorporating the supernatural into their daily experience, as one might accommodate an eccentric relative. In the year 1876, Reverend Bull built an addition to the rectory, a new wing to accommodate his still-growing household. The construction disturbed the grounds, excavating foundations, laying new brickwork, joining the addition to the existing structure. During this work, or perhaps because of it, the phenomena seemed to intensify. More sightings were reported, more unexplained sounds, more occasions when objects moved without visible cause. The workmen spoke among themselves of unease, of feeling unwelcome, of accidents that seemed to occur with unusual frequency, tools that vanished and reappeared in strange locations, materials that shifted overnight, the sensation of being watched by hostile eyes. The rectory stood complete in its expanded form, a sprawling maze of rooms and corridors, staircases that led to different levels, passages that connected the old structure to the new. It was easy to become lost within the house, to take a wrong turn and find oneself in an unfamiliar hallway. The architecture created spaces that felt isolated even when others dwelt nearby, rooms where sound did not carry, where one could call out and receive no answer, because the voice failed to penetrate the thick walls and closed doors. Reverend Bull lived in the rectory until his death in the year 1927. He had served as rector of Borley for more than 4 decades, raising his children within those walls, conducting his ministry, enduring whatever the house chose to manifest. When he died, the rectory passed to his son, Harry Bull, who had succeeded his father in the living. Harry Bull had grown up in the house, had witnessed the phenomena throughout his childhood and youth, and perhaps for that reason accepted them without alarm. He continued to live there, maintaining the property, fulfilling the duties of rector, dwelling in the rooms that had sheltered his family for so many years. But Harry Bull's time at Borley would be brief. He died in the year 1927, only months after his father's passing. The rectory stood empty then, waiting for the next occupant. Its rooms silent but for the sounds that came from no living source, its gardens overgrown, the nuns' walk shadowed by trees that had witnessed too much. The house had acquired a reputation by then, spoken of throughout Suffolk and beyond as a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead had grown dangerously thin. Chapter 2. The Nun of Borley. The legend predated the rectory by centuries, woven into the consciousness of the village like fog settles into the hollows of the marshland. The people who worked the fields and tended their cottages spoke of it with the certainty that comes from repeated telling, from stories passed down through generations until they acquire the weight of fact. They said the monastery had stood upon the grounds in the days when England bowed to Rome, when monks in brown robes walked the cloisters and chanted their hours from matins to compline. The exact location of the monastery remained uncertain. No ruins survived above ground, no walls or foundations marked the landscape in a way that could be measured and mapped. But the belief persisted that it had been there, somewhere beneath the soil that would later bear the rectory, or perhaps spreading across the grounds that became lawn and garden. The nun story existed in multiple versions, each telling shaped by the person who spoke it and the audience who listened. The core remained constant, but the details shifted like water finding different channels through the same landscape. In the most common account, she had been a young woman of good family, perhaps placed in the convent at Bourges by parents who lacked sufficient dowry for an advantageous marriage, or who wished to secure spiritual merit through dedicating a daughter to religious life. The convent at Bourges stood some miles distant from Borley, close enough for occasional interaction between the religious houses, but far enough to maintain appropriate separation. She had been beautiful, this nun, though beauty was a quality rarely mentioned in religious contexts, often viewed with suspicion as a temptation or vanity. But the legend insisted upon it, as though her physical form had played some role in the tragedy that followed. Dark hair, perhaps, hidden beneath her veil, eyes that spoke of intelligence and longing, a face that retained softness despite the austerities of convent life, the sparse meals, the hours of prayer, the cold stone floors and unheated cells. The monk had dwelt at the monastery in Borley, or so the story claimed. He would have worn the habit of his order, followed the Benedictine rule with its emphasis on prayer and labour, lived in obedience to his abbot and the vows he had taken. How they met remained unclear in all versions of the tale. Perhaps their religious houses had some official connection, some reason for occasional contact. Perhaps she had travelled with other sisters on some errand that brought them to Borley. Perhaps it was mere chance, a meeting at a market or fair where religious and secular worlds briefly intersected. However it began, they fell into love, that most human and most dangerous of emotions. Love that violated every vow they had taken, that transgressed the boundaries their orders had erected between the sexes, that threatened their immortal souls with the sin of unchastity. They must have met in secret, finding moments stolen from the structured hours of religious life. A glance exchanged in a church, words spoken in a garden, hands touching in the shadows where no one watched. The risk was absolute. Discovery meant punishment, disgrace, the loss of everything they had known. They planned to flee together. The monks somehow acquired a coach or arranged with a sympathetic party to provide one. They would escape in darkness, travel through the night, reach a port perhaps, and take ship to the continent where they might disappear into cities large enough to swallow 2 fugitives from English religious houses. They would marry if they could find a priest willing to perform the ceremony, or simply live as husband and wife without the blessing of the church. They would trade their eternal salvation for the years they might have together, for the possibility of ordinary life, a home, perhaps children, the simple rhythms of days not marked by bells and liturgy. The night came when they had arranged to meet. The hour was late, chosen for the darkness it provided, for the certainty that others would be asleep. The nun slipped from her convent, making her way through corridors and passages she had walked for years, avoiding the places where light might burn or where a sister might keep vigil. She carried nothing, or perhaps only the clothes she wore and whatever small possessions she could conceal. The distance to Borley would need to be covered on foot until she reached the meeting place where the coach waited. But someone knew. Someone had discovered their plan through betrayal or accident, or the watchfulness that religious houses maintained over their members. The versions of the story diverge sharply here, unable to agree on what happened in those final hours. Some said the nun was seized before she could reach the meeting place, dragged back to her convent by men sent to prevent her escape. Others claimed she reached Borley, found the monk waiting with the coach, and they were captured together as they prepared to depart. Still others suggested they actually departed, travelled some distance before being overtaken on the road and returned to face judgment. The punishment was terrible. Medieval canon law provided various penalties for religious who violated their vows, ranging from severe penance to imprisonment to excommunication. But the legend insisted upon a darker fate, one that exceeded official sanction and entered the realm of vengeance. The monk was executed, beheaded perhaps, his body denied proper burial. The nun suffered worse. She was taken to the cellar of the monastery at Borley, or to some underground chamber, and there she was bricked up alive within the walls. The masons came with their stones and mortar, building a prison from which there could be no escape. They sealed her in darkness, in a space too small to stand or lie properly, where air would slowly diminish, and thirst would drive her to madness before death came as mercy. This was the punishment for those who betrayed their vows, who chose earthly love over divine devotion, who attempted to flee from the life they had promised to God. She died there in the darkness, alone, her screams unheard or ignored, her prayers for deliverance unanswered. Her body remained within the walls, hidden in the earth, unmourned and forgotten by all except those who whispered the tale through the generations that followed. But death brought no rest. Her spirit could not depart, bound perhaps by the violence of her end, by the injustice of her punishment, by the love that had driven her to risk everything and gained her only suffering. She walked the grounds where she had hoped to escape, travelling the path she might have taken to freedom, searching eternally for the lover who had been killed, for the life that had been stolen, for some release from the endless repetition of her tragedy. The sightings began long before the rectory was built. Farmers working the fields at twilight reported seeing a figure in dark habit, crossing the land. Travellers on the lane that passed near the old monastery grounds claimed to glimpse a woman in religious dress, walking among the trees. Always she moved in the same direction, following the same route, as though retracing steps taken on that fatal night. Always she appeared at certain times, twilight most commonly, but also in the hours before dawn, or on particular dates that might correspond to the anniversary of her death. Always she vanished when approached, fading like mortar-cooked mist when the sun touched it, leaving only empty air and the uneasy conviction that something had been present that defied natural explanation. When the rectory was constructed in the 1860s, when the ground was disturbed by foundations and gardens and the elaborate drainage required for such a building in marshy land, the sightings increased. The nun walked the lawn, appearing to residents and visitors alike. She was seen from windows, glimpsed in the garden, encountered on the path that came to bear her name. Sometimes she appeared solid, substantial, detailed enough that witnesses noted the style of her habit, the way she held her hands, the pace of her movement. Other times she seemed translucent, barely visible, more suggestion than substance. But always she walked, patient and silent, maintaining her eternal vigil. The Reverend Bull and his family grew familiar with her presence. She became part of the household's experience, mentioned in letters and diaries discussed among the children with a mixture of fear and fascination. Some of the Bull children claimed to have seen her clearly, to have been close enough to note her height and build, though never her face, which remained forever obscured. Others heard only the accounts from siblings or servants, but believed them nonetheless because the house itself seemed to confirm the possibility of such encounters. The nun appeared to some as a figure of sorrow, a woman condemned to endless wandering, deserving of pity rather than fear. Others perceived menace in her manifestations, sensing anger or desperation in her movements, in the way she sometimes turned toward the house as though searching for entry, for confrontation with the living who occupied the space where she had suffered. A few claimed she tried to communicate, reaching out a hand or seeming to speak, though no sound emerged. Most simply saw her walk and vanish, a recurring presence that marked the passage of seasons and years. The legend offered no hope of release for her. There was no ritual that might free her spirit, no prayer that could grant her passage to whatever realm awaited the dead. The crime of her love and her violated vows had bound her to the earth, and there she would remain until some unknown condition was fulfilled or time itself concluded. The house that rose upon the monastery grounds became her domain. The witnesses to her walking became participants in her story and the tragedy that had unfolded in the Medieval past continued its slow unfolding in the present. Attempts were made to verify the legend, to find historical records that might confirm the existence of the monastery, the identities of the lovers, the date of the tragedy. Local historians searched through ecclesiastical documents, through the records of the dissolution when monasteries were catalogued before destruction, through the parish registers and property deeds that survived from earlier centuries. But the evidence remained elusive. The monastery at Borley was mentioned in some documents, but details were sparse. No record survived of a nun and monk who had attempted to flee, no account of executions or unusual punishments that matched the story. The legend existed in oral tradition, in the collective memory of the village, in the persistent sightings that seemed to confirm its truth even when documents did not. Yet something walked the grounds at Borley. Too many witnesses, spanning too many years, from too many different circumstances had seen the figure in religious habit for it to be dismissed as collective delusion or deliberate fabrication. The sightings continued regardless of who occupied the rectory, regardless of whether the observers believed in ghosts or sought rational explanations. She appeared to skeptics and believers alike, to strangers who knew nothing of the legend and to locals who had heard the tale since childhood. She was there, constant as the marshland fog, silent as the graves that lay in the churchyard, eternal as the questions that haunted the living who encountered her. The nun of Borley walked. She had walked for centuries before the rectory was built, and she would continue walking through all the years that followed, through all the investigations and the fire and the ruins. She was the heart of the haunting, the source from which all other phenomena seemed to flow, the tragic figure whose presence transformed an ordinary house into the most haunted dwelling in England. Chapter 3: The Bull Family and Early Hauntings. The house filled with children and their noise, with lessons and prayers, and the ordinary chaos of a large Victorian family. Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull had fathered 14 children across the years of his first and second marriages, and the rectory that had seemed so spacious when first constructed quickly became crowded with life. The children ranged through the rooms and corridors, claimed bedrooms and corners for themselves, established territories and routines that shaped their days. Servants moved through the household attending to endless tasks, fires to be lit, meals to be prepared, laundry to be managed, floors to be swept. The rectory functioned as any substantial home of its era, governed by the rhythms of Victorian domestic life and the particular demands of a clergyman's household. But alongside the normal activities of family life, another pattern emerged, subtle at first but growing more pronounced as the years accumulated. The house revealed itself to be something other than ordinary bricks and mortar, something that harboured presences and produced occurrences that could not be explained by drafts or settling foundations, or the tricks that old buildings played upon perception. The phenomena began almost immediately after the family took up residence, though in those early years they were dismissed or rationalised, attributed to natural causes or the unfamiliarity of a new dwelling. The footsteps came first. People heard them in corridors when no one walked there, heard them on the stairs when the household was accounted for in other rooms. The sound was distinct, the measured tread of an adult, the creak of floorboards underweight, the particular rhythm that indicated purposeful movement rather than random noise. A person lying in bed at night would hear footsteps past the door, would rise to investigate and find the hallway empty, the sounds fading as though the walker had turned a corner or descended stairs. Servants working in the kitchen heard footsteps crossing the floor above, assumed a family member had entered one of the upper rooms, and later discovered that all the family had been elsewhere, that the upper floor had been vacant. The footsteps followed patterns. Certain corridors seemed favoured, particularly the passage on the second floor that connected the older part of the house to the addition built in the 1870s. The sounds occurred most frequently in evening or night hours, though daytime incidents were also reported. Sometimes multiple people heard the same footsteps simultaneously, confirming to each other that the sound was not imaginary. Other times, the phenomenon was experienced by a single person, leaving them uncertain whether to trust their senses or doubt their own perception. Doors became problematic. The house contained many doors, necessary in Victorian architecture to separate rooms and maintain privacy and heat. These doors were substantial things fitted with brass handles and hinges, requiring deliberate effort to open or close. Yet they moved of their own accord with disturbing frequency. A door left open would be found closed. A door carefully shut and even locked would be discovered standing ajar. People saw doors open before their eyes, the handle turning, the door swinging wide to reveal an empty room beyond. Others heard doors slam in distant parts of the house, violent enough to shake the walls, but investigation revealed no wind or draft that might have caused such force. The Blue Room proved particularly troublesome. Located on the first floor, it had been designated as one of the principal bedrooms, furnished appropriately for family use or guests. But people who slept in the Blue Room reported disturbed nights. They woke to find the temperature had dropped precipitously, their breath visible in air that had been comfortable when they retired. They felt presences in the room, the unmistakable sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Some heard breathing that did not come from any living occupant. Others experienced the bedclothes being pulled away, as though invisible hands tugged at the sheets and blankets. Several of the Bull children refused to sleep in the Blue Room after single nights spent there, preferring to crowd into other bedrooms or even sleep in less comfortable quarters rather than return to that particular chamber. Objects moved without explanation. A book left on a table would be found on a shelf across the room. Keys vanished from their customary hooks and appeared days later in bizarre locations. Servants complained that items in the kitchen rearranged themselves overnight. Pots and pans found in different cupboards, utensils discovered in drawers where they did not belong. The disruption was not violent or destructive, but persistent and unsettling, as though some presence amused itself by introducing disorder into the household's carefully maintained organisation. Lights were seen in windows when the rooms beyond stood dark. People outside the house, returning from evening visits or walking the grounds, would see illumination in upper windows, would assume a family member had entered the room and lit a lamp, only to discover later that no one had been there, that the room had remained unoccupied and dark. The lights were described as yellowish, flickering like candlelight, moving sometimes as though carried by someone crossing the room. They appeared most often in certain windows, one particular bedroom, a landing window on the staircase, windows in the addition that Reverend Bull had constructed. The children saw things. Being young, perhaps more open to perception than adults who had learned to filter their experience through rational frameworks, the Bull children encountered the house's phenomena with frightening regularity. They saw figures in hallways, people who vanished when approached or when the child called out. They heard voices speaking in empty rooms, conversations in tones too low to distinguish words. One daughter reported seeing a man in old-fashioned clothing standing at the foot of her bed, watching her in silence before fading away. Another child described a woman in grey who appeared in the garden, standing motionless among the trees, who was not the phantom nun but someone else, someone younger perhaps or wearing different garments. The servants experienced the phenomena as well, and their accounts added to the growing documentation of the house's peculiarities. A maid working alone in one of the upper rooms felt a hand touch her shoulder, turned to find no one there. A cook in the kitchen heard her name called clearly, answered and approached the doorway, expecting to find a family member needing something, but the passage was empty. The coachman reported hearing horses in the stable at night, went to investigate thinking an animal had taken ill, and found the horses calm and undisturbed, though the sounds of restless movement continued around him in the darkness. The cellars inspired particular dread. Few ventured below willingly, and those who descended for coal or stored provisions hastened about their business, unwilling to linger in those underground spaces. The cellars extended beneath much of the house, a series of chambers with flagstone floors and brick walls, lit inadequately by whatever lamp or candle the person carried. The air was cold and damp, carrying the smell of earth and stone and old mortar. But beyond the normal unpleasantness of cellars, these spaces conveyed menace. People reported feeling watched, feeling presences moving in the darkness beyond the reach of their light. Some heard sounds, scraping, rustling, whispers that might have been air moving through cracks in the foundation or might have been something else. Several servants refused outright to go into the cellars alone, insisting on companionship even for brief errands. Reverend Bull maintained a studied calm regarding the phenomena. He was a man of education and faith, trained in theology at Cambridge, ordained to serve the Church of England. He had built the rectory to serve his family and his pastoral duties, and he would not be driven from it by unexplained occurrences, however frequent or disturbing. He acknowledged the phenomena when questioned, confirmed that yes, unusual things happened in the house, but he refused to grant them significance. Perhaps he viewed them as tests of faith, as Job had been tested. Perhaps he simply accepted them as one might accept any peculiarity of a dwelling, a roof that leaked in certain winds, a chimney that drew poorly, a house that happened to harbour ghosts. His children absorbed his attitude to varying degrees. Some grew accustomed to the phenomena, incorporating them into daily life the way one adapts to any environmental constant. Others remained frightened, slept poorly, dreaded certain rooms or times of day. But all stayed, because family cohesion demanded it, because Victorian children did not question parental decisions, because the rectory was their home despite whatever else inhabited it with them. The phantom nun continued her walks through these years, seen by multiple members of the household. Reverend Bull witnessed her himself on several occasions, noted her appearances in his journals with the same attention he gave to parish business and family events. He attempted once to approach her, walking quickly across the lawn toward the figure moving along the tree-lined path. But she faded as he came near, became translucent and then invisible, leaving him standing alone in the garden with only the certainty that something had been there moments before. The family attempted various explanations. Perhaps the house had been built upon disturbed ground, upon foundations that intersected old graves or chambers from the monastery period. Perhaps the land itself retained records of past events, replaying them like a phonograph repeating a recorded sound. Perhaps the phenomena were natural but not yet understood by science, electromagnetic effects or geological properties that created illusions of presence and movement. But these explanations satisfied decreasingly as the phenomena persisted and accumulated, as the experiences multiplied beyond what rationalization could comfortably accommodate. Visitors to the rectory experienced the phenomena as well, providing external validation that could not be dismissed as family delusion or collective suggestion. Guests staying overnight reported disturbed sleep, heard the same footsteps and door sounds that troubled the household. People calling on parish business mentioned seeing figures in windows or corridors, asked about family members they had glimpsed, only to be told that no one had been in those locations. The phenomena did not limit themselves to believers or the superstitious, but manifested regardless of the witness's predisposition, affecting skeptics and rationalists as readily as those inclined towards supernatural interpretations. Reverend Bull lived in the rectory until 1927, more than 4 decades in a house that had revealed itself to be inhabited by more than flesh and blood. He raised his children there, buried 2 wives, conducted his ministry, endured the phenomena with stoic acceptance. When he died, having served as rector of Borley for his entire adult life, the house passed to his son Harry Bull, who had grown up within those walls and knew their peculiarities as intimately as he knew his own family. Harry Bull's tenure would be brief. Only months before his own death left the rectory vacant once more, but in that short time the phenomena continued unabated, confirming that whatever dwelt in the house was not attached to a particular occupant but to the structure itself, to the land beneath it, to some quality that would persist regardless of who lived or died within its walls. Chapter 4. The footsteps in empty rooms. The house accumulated its hauntings the way stone gathers moss, through persistence and time and the particular conditions that allowed such growth. Through the decades of the Bull family's occupation, the phenomena became not merely incidents to be noted, but a continuous presence, a parallel existence that unfolded alongside the ordinary domestic life of the rectory. What had begun as occasional disturbances evolved into daily occurrences, into an atmosphere so saturated with strangeness that the line between natural and supernatural blurred until it could no longer be clearly drawn. The footsteps became almost constant. Day and night, heard by servants and family alike, they echoed through corridors and across floors with such regularity that people learned to recognize their patterns. Certain routes seemed favoured. The second-floor passage that connected the original structure to the addition, the main staircase that descended from upper floors to the entrance hall, the corridor outside the blue room. The sound was always the same, measured and deliberate, neither hurried nor hesitant, the tread of someone moving with purpose through a familiar space. But no living person walked there when the sounds occurred. No flesh and blood resident could be found to account for the noise. People learned to distinguish between ordinary footsteps and the phantom variety. Normal walking produced sounds that faded naturally with distance, that correlated with visible movement when one looked to see who approached. The phantom footsteps followed different rules. They might begin in the middle of a corridor as though the walker had materialized there, might cease abruptly without the sound of a door opening or closing, might fade in ways that suggested the walker had passed through a wall rather than using a doorway. Sometimes the footsteps descended the main staircase from top to bottom, each step creaking in sequence, but investigation revealed no one on the stairs and no person who could have completed the descent in the time it took someone to reach the entrance hall. The heaviness of the tread suggested a man rather than a woman, though this detail remained uncertain. Some witnesses insisted the footsteps sounded like riding boots on floorboards, a particular kind of heel strike that brought to mind country squires or military men. Others heard softer footfalls that might belong to anyone. Occasionally, multiple witnesses in different parts of the house heard footsteps simultaneously in their respective locations, as though several phantom walkers moved through the rectory at once, though whether these represented different entities or some peculiarity of how sound manifested remained impossible to determine. The sounds did not respond to investigation. A person hearing footsteps might rush to the corridor to confront the walker, only to find emptiness. The sounds did not flee from pursuit, but simply ceased, as though the act of looking directly at the space where they occurred caused them to collapse back into whatever realm had produced them. This quality suggested the phenomena were not conscious or aware of observers, but rather some kind of residual haunting, an impression left in the fabric of the house that repeated itself without intelligence or intention. Yet other phenomena suggested awareness, intention, even malice. Doors slammed with violence that seemed designed to startle or frighten. Objects moved in ways that could not be attributed to accident or natural causes, placed deliberately in locations where they would be noticed, arranged in patterns that suggested purpose. People felt pushed or pulled by invisible forces, experienced sensations of hands grasping at them in empty rooms. These incidents implied something more than residual impressions, something that perceived the living inhabitants and chose to interact with them. The bell tower became a focal point of activity. Reverend Bull had incorporated a bell tower into the design of the house, a feature unusual for a private residence but perhaps appropriate for a rectory that served ecclesiastical functions. The tower rose above the roofline, accessible by a narrow staircase, housing a bell that could be rung for various purposes. But people heard the bell sound when no one had climbed the tower to ring it, heard it toll at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, waking the household with its resonant clamour. Investigation invariably revealed the bell rope hanging undisturbed, the bell itself motionless, no explanation for the sound that had roused everyone from sleep. Apparitions multiplied beyond the phantom nun. Family members and servants reported seeing various figures throughout the house. A man in dark clothing observed on the lawn, a woman in the Victorian dress glimpsed through the doorway, children playing in the garden who vanished when approached. These figures possessed different qualities than the nun. Some appeared solid and detailed, visible for several seconds before vanishing. Others manifested as shadows or dark shapes, humanoid in form but lacking distinct features. A few seemed aware of observers, turning to look at the witness before disappearing, while others moved through their actions as though unaware of the living people watching them. One particular apparition became known to the household through repeated sightings. A man in a frock coat, the style suggesting the mid-19th century, was seen in various rooms of the house. He appeared most often in the study or near the staircase, standing motionless or walking slowly as though inspecting the premises. Some witnesses reported he had a sad or stern expression, though getting close enough to see facial features proved impossible. He never spoke, never acknowledged the living, simply manifested and then faded, leaving behind only the troubled certainty that something from another time had briefly intersected with the present. The coach and horses continued their spectral journeys. The sound of hooves on gravel, the rattle of wheels, the jingle of harness, these sounds were heard repeatedly by residents and occasional visitors who happened to be awake in the early morning hours. The phantom coach always followed the same route, approaching the house along the drive, pulling up as though to discharge passengers, then departing again. A few witnesses claimed to have seen the coach itself, not just heard it, describing a dark carriage drawn by two horses, though details remained vague and the sighting always occurred in conditions of poor visibility, twilight or darkness or fog. Music was heard in empty rooms, particularly the sound of an organ, though the instrument in the house stood untouched. The music was described as sacred in character, hymns or chants that might have been sung in a monastery chapel centuries before. Sometimes the sounds seemed to come from below the house, from the cellars, or from beneath the foundations, as though rising from spaces buried deep in the earth. Other times the music filled certain rooms, surrounding witnesses with sound that had no visible source, that continued for minutes before fading back into silence. Smells manifested without cause, the scent of incense in rooms where nothing burned, the smell of flowers where no blooms existed. Occasionally foul odours that appeared suddenly, and then dissipated, leaving behind questions about their origin. The incense smell seemed particularly significant, suggesting religious ritual, the kind of ceremonial burning of frankincense or myrrh that would have been common in medieval monasteries. Its appearance in the house implied some connection to the religious past of the site, some echo of practices performed centuries ago. Cold spots became a recognised feature of certain locations. The temperature in a particular area of a room would drop dramatically, without drafts or other natural explanation. A person could stand with one hand in normal warmth and the other in air cold enough to produce visible breath. The cold moved sometimes, shifting from one location to another, as though something passed through the space, drawing heat from the air or perhaps manifesting in a way that displaced warmth. These cold spots were most pronounced in the blue room and in the cellars, but appeared occasionally throughout the house. Animals responded to the phenomena in ways that suggested they perceived things invisible to human senses. Dogs brought to the house by visitors would refuse to enter certain rooms, would bark at empty spaces or cower in corners for no apparent reason. Cats displayed the behaviour common to their species when perceiving things humans could not see, fixating on empty air, following movement with their eyes though nothing visible moved, acting agitated or fearful without obvious cause. The horses in the stable were sometimes found distressed in the morning, sweating and trembling, as though they had been frightened during the night by something in or near the building where they were kept. The phenomena escalated during certain periods, particularly around anniversaries of significant dates, though determining which dates held significance proved difficult. Late July and early August seemed particularly active, with increased frequency of sightings and sounds. Some suggested these dates corresponded to the anniversary of the nuns' tragic end, though no historical record confirmed the exact date of the events described in legend. Other periods of heightened activity corresponded to nothing obvious, suggesting either that the phenomena followed patterns unknown to the living observers, or that they were triggered by factors unrelated to calendar dates. Attempts to document the phenomena remained sporadic during the Bull family's tenure. This was an era before systematic paranormal investigation, before organisations existed to record and study such occurrences. The incidents were noted in diaries and letters, mentioned in conversations, became part of the household's oral history, but no comprehensive record was maintained. The family lived with the hauntings as an accepted aspect of their environment, remarkable but not necessarily requiring investigation or explanation beyond the acknowledgement that their house was unusual. The rectory's reputation spread through the region. Local people knew of the haunting, spoke of it in public houses and shops, warned newcomers to the area about the strange dwelling on the edge of the village. Some avoided the property entirely, refusing invitations to visit or quickly departing when their presence there became necessary. Others came deliberately, hoping to witness the phenomena for themselves, to see the phantom nun or hear the footsteps or experience whatever manifestations the house might offer. The Bull family accommodated such visitors with varying degrees of patience, neither encouraging nor entirely discouraging the curiosity that their home inspired. Through all these years, through all the accumulating incidents and increasingly strange atmosphere, the house stood solid and ordinary in appearance. By daylight, it was simply a large Victorian rectory, red brick and Gothic details, windows reflecting sky and clouds, garden and lawn maintained by regular labour. Nothing in its external appearance suggested the strangeness within. Only those who dwelt there, who experienced the phenomena firsthand, who lived day after day with the footsteps and the cold spots and the figures glimpsed in corridors, understood that Borley Rectory had become something more than a building. It had become a threshold between worlds, a place where the past refused to remain past, where the dead walked among the living, and where the normal laws that governed reality seemed not to apply with their usual force. Chapter 5. The Smith Family's Terror. The rectory stood empty through the winter months of 1927 and into the spring of the following year. After Harry Bull's death, the property remained without occupant while the church authorities sought a new rector for the parish. The house settled into silence during those months, its rooms undisturbed by human presence, its corridors walked only by whatever entities had made their home within those walls. The gardens grew wild, the lawn went unmaintained, and the building took on the desolate appearance of abandoned dwellings, though legally it remained church property awaiting its next resident. In the early summer of 1928, the Reverend Guy Eric Smith arrived with his wife Mabel to take up the living at Borley. Smith was a man in his middle years, educated and earnest in his faith, looking forward to the responsibilities of parish ministry. His wife was younger, a woman of refined sensibilities and practical disposition. Neither had any particular interest in the supernatural, nor had they been informed in any detail about the rectory's reputation. The church authorities who appointed Smith may have been unaware of the house's peculiarities, or perhaps they chose not to mention them, fearing that such information might discourage a potential tenant for a property that had acquired an unfortunate notoriety. The Smiths moved into the rectory with their belongings and their expectations of ordinary domestic life. They engaged servants to help maintain the large house, began the work of establishing themselves in the community, attended to the usual tasks of settling into a new residence. The first days passed normally enough. The house was old and required attention, repairs to be made, rooms to be aired and cleaned after months of vacancy, furniture to be arranged. The work kept them occupied, too busy perhaps to notice subtler signs that might have warned them what lay ahead. The phenomena began within the first week. Mabel Smith was in the kitchen when she heard footsteps crossing the floor above. She assumed her husband had gone upstairs for something, thought nothing of it, continued with her work. But when she went to find him minutes later, she discovered him in the study on the ground floor, working at correspondence. He had not been upstairs. The servants were accounted for in other parts of the house. No one had walked across the upper floor, yet she had heard the sounds clearly, deliberate footsteps moving from one end of the house to the other. That night, lying in bed in the room they had chosen for themselves, both husband and wife heard footsteps in the corridor outside their door. The sounds passed along the hallway, distinct and measured, the tread of someone walking with purpose. Reverend Smith rose, opened the door quickly, expecting to find a servant or perhaps an intruder who had entered the house. The corridor stood empty, lit dimly by the lamp he carried. No one was there. The sounds had ceased the moment he opened the door, as though his action had interrupted whatever had been walking there. The incidents multiplied rapidly. doors opened and closed throughout the house with disturbing frequency. The Smiths would secure doors at night, checking each one before retiring, only to find them standing open in the morning. Interior doors swung on their hinges during the day, moving without wind or draft to explain the motion. Once, Mabel Smith watched a door at the end of a corridor slowly open while she stood observing it, the handle turning, the door swinging inward to reveal the empty room beyond. She called to her husband, who came and examined the door, finding nothing mechanically wrong with it, no explanation for why it should move without someone operating it. Bells rang when no one pulled the bell ropes. The house had a system of servants' bells, wires running through the walls connected to pull handles in various rooms, allowing family members to summon assistance. These bells rang at odd hours, jangling in the servants' hall when all the family was present and accounted for, when no one had touched the pull cords. The servants complained about being summoned to empty rooms, about responding to bells that rang without human agency, about the unsettling feeling that something in the house demanded their attention, though no person had called for them. Objects moved. Items carefully placed on tables or shelves would be found in different locations. Keys vanished and reappeared in bizarre places. Once, a small vase that had been sitting on the mantelpiece in the drawing room was discovered in the garden, set neatly on the grass as though someone had carried it outside and placed it there deliberately. Books were found open to pages that neither Smith nor his wife had been reading. Small items went missing for days and then returned, appearing in obvious locations where they could not have been overlooked during previous searches. The blue room proved uninhabitable. The Smiths had initially intended to use it as a guest room, but the first night someone slept there produced such disturbed rest and frightening experiences that the room was abandoned. The guest, a family friend visiting for a few days, reported waking repeatedly during the night, feeling a presence in the room, experiencing extreme cold despite adequate blankets and a fire that had been lit in the grate. She heard breathing that was not her own, felt the bedclothes being tugged, and saw a shadow form standing near the window that did not correspond to any piece of furniture or natural play of moonlight. She left the room before dawn, spent the remainder of the night in a chair in the hallway, and departed the rectory the following morning despite protestations that she had intended to stay longer. Mabel Smith began to experience more direct phenomena. She felt touches on her shoulder or arm when she worked alone in rooms. She heard her name called in a voice she did not recognize, turned, expecting to find someone needing her attention, and found only empty space. Once, while ascending the staircase, she felt a hand press against her back, firm enough to make her stumble forward, though no one was behind her on the stairs. The sensation was unmistakable. Not imagination or a momentary loss of balance, but the definite pressure of a palm between her shoulder blades, pushing her as though to make her hurry or perhaps to cause her to fall. The phantom nun appeared to both of them within the first month of their residence. Reverend Smith saw her one evening as twilight gathered, glimpsed through a window the figure in dark habit walking along the path beneath the trees. He called his wife, and they both watched the figure move slowly across the lawn, following the route that locals called the Nuns' Walk. The figure was substantial enough to be clearly visible, detailed enough that they could see the way the fabric of the habit moved with her steps, the way she held her hands clasped before her. But when Smith went outside to approach her, to speak with her if she were a living person, or to confirm her supernatural nature if she were not, the figure faded as he came near, becoming translucent and then vanishing entirely before he could reach her. The cellars terrified the servants. The cook refused to go below for any reason, insisting that other staff retrieve whatever was needed from the storage chambers. Those who did descend reported overwhelming feelings of dread, of being watched by hostile presences, of hearing sounds in the darkness beyond the reach of their lamps. One servant claimed to have seen eyes gleaming in a corner of the cellar, reflecting the lamplight the way an animal's eyes might. But when he moved to investigate, nothing was there. Another reported hearing chains rattling in the underground spaces, a sound that suggested medieval dungeons or prisoners, though no chains existed in the cellars as far as anyone knew. Strange lights were observed by neighbours and people passing on the road. Windows in the rectory would glow with illumination when the house should have been dark, when the Smith family had retired for the night and no lamps had been left burning. The lights moved sometimes, visible in one window and then another, as though someone carried a candle from room to room. But investigation by the Smiths revealed their house dark and undisturbed. No fires lit, no candles burning, no explanation for the lights that others had seen. The atmosphere of the house began to affect the Smiths' health and spirits. Mabel grew nervous and easily startled, dreaded being alone in any part of the house, found her sleep disturbed by dreams and by the sounds that came in the night. Reverend Smith maintained a stoic exterior, but his diary entries from this period reveal growing concern and bewilderment. He was a rational man, educated in an age of science and progress, yet he found himself living in circumstances that defied rational explanation. He attempted to maintain his ministry, to fulfill his duties to the parish, but the house demanded increasing amounts of his attention and emotional energy. They attempted various remedies. Reverend Smith performed blessings, read prayers in every room of the house, sprinkled holy water in corners and doorways. The phenomena continued unabated, seemingly unaffected by religious ritual. They had the house examined for structural problems that might cause sounds or movements. Faulty foundations, settling timbers, poorly fitted doors and windows. Nothing was found that could account for what they experienced. They questioned local people, learned for the first time the full extent of the rectory's reputation, heard stories of the Bull family's experiences spanning decades. The knowledge did not comfort them, but rather increased their distress, confirming that what they endured was not temporary or unique, but parties of a long pattern of haunting. By midsummer, Mabel Smith had reached the limits of her endurance. She could not continue living in the house, could not spend another night listening to footsteps in empty corridors, to doors slamming, to her name being called by voices that had no source. She urged her husband to request a transfer to another parish, to abandon Borley and its haunted rectory before something worse occurred. But such a request took time, required approval from church authorities, could not be accomplished immediately, even with the best of reasons. In desperation, the Smiths decided to seek outside help. They had heard of investigators who studied supernatural phenomena, people who approached such matters with scientific methods and open minds. Perhaps such investigators could determine what haunted the rectory, could find some way to end the phenomena, or at least explain them in terms that would make them bearable. Reverend Smith composed a letter, brief and urgent, describing their situation and requesting assistance. The letter was addressed to the Daily Mirror newspaper in London, to the attention of anyone who might know of investigators willing to examine a haunted house. Smith was not a man given to sensationalism or publicity, but the situation had become desperate enough to overcome his natural reticence. He wrote plainly about the phenomena they had experienced, emphasized that both he and his wife were of sound mind and good character, noted that previous occupants had experienced similar occurrences spanning many years. He requested that someone with expertise in such matters come to Borley to investigate the rectory and perhaps offer some relief from the haunting that had made their lives nearly unbearable. The letter reached the newspaper offices and was forwarded to a man whose name would become inextricably linked with Borley Rectory. Harry Price was a paranormal investigator, a man who had dedicated much of his life to the study of supernatural phenomena. He had investigated numerous cases, exposed frauds, documented genuine mysteries, and built a reputation as someone who approached the paranormal with both skepticism and serious scientific inquiry. When he received the Smiths' plea for help, he recognized immediately the potential significance of the case. A haunted rectory with a long history of phenomena, inhabited by credible witnesses who had nothing to gain from fabrication. This was exactly the kind of case that could yield important evidence about the nature of hauntings. Harry Price wrote back to Reverend Smith expressing interest in visiting Borley to conduct an investigation. He would bring equipment, he wrote, instruments that might detect or measure whatever forces operated in the house. He would interview the witnesses, examine the premises, attempt to experience the phenomena himself. If the rectory was truly as haunted as the letter suggested, it represented an extraordinary extraordinary opportunity for paranormal research. The Smiths agreed immediately. They would welcome Price and his investigation. They would cooperate fully, provide access to the entire house, describe everything they had experienced. Their hope, perhaps naive, was that scientific investigation might somehow resolve the haunting, might release them from the grip of whatever entities shared the rectory with them. At the very least, Price's visit would provide external validation that they were not imagining things, that the house truly was as strange and terrifying as it seemed to them in their increasingly sleepless nights. Harry Price made arrangements to visit Borley. He gathered his equipment, prepared his questionnaires and documentation methods, anticipated what might prove to be one of the most significant investigations of his career. The date was set for June of 1929. Price would come to the rectory, would bring the tools and methods of paranormal investigation to bear upon the mystery of Borley, would begin the process of examining and documenting what would eventually be called the most haunted house in England. Chapter 6. Harry Price and the investigation begins. The summer morning when Harry Price arrived at Borley Rectory carried the heavy warmth that sometimes settled over the Suffolk marshlands, the air thick with moisture rising from the low-lying fields. Price came by motorcar from London, travelling through the countryside until he reached the village, and then the lane that led to the rectory. The house stood as he had imagined from the descriptions in the Smiths' correspondence. A substantial Victorian structure of red brick, multiple stories, Gothic details that gave it a vaguely ecclesiastical appearance appropriate to its function. Gardens surrounded the building, somewhat overgrown but not entirely neglected. Trees lined the drive and bordered the lawn. Nothing in the external appearance suggested the phenomena that had driven the current residents to seek his assistance. Price was 45 years old in the summer of 1929, a man who'd spent decades pursuing the investigation of supernatural claims. He had been born into comfortable circumstances, educated sufficiently to move in professional society, and had early developed an interest in conjuring an illusion. This background in the mechanics of deception served him well in paranormal investigation, as he could recognize the tricks and techniques used by fraudulent mediums and spirit manifestations. But Price was not merely a debunker. He maintained a genuine curiosity about the possibility of supernatural phenomena, believed that rigorous scientific investigation might reveal truths about the nature of consciousness, death, and the universe that conventional science had not yet acknowledged. He had founded the National Laboratory of Psychical Research in London, an organisation dedicated to the scientific study of paranormal. Normal phenomena. The laboratory housed equipment designed to detect and measure various aspects of hauntings and spiritual manifestations, thermometers to record temperature changes, instruments to measure electromagnetic fields, cameras for capturing images of phenomena, recording devices for documenting sounds. Price approached investigations systematically, gathering testimony, documenting conditions, attempting to replicate phenomena under controlled circumstances. His methods combined skepticism with openness, demanding evidence but willing to accept genuine phenomena if the evidence proved sufficient. The Smiths greeted him with evident relief. They had lived with the haunting for little more than a year, but the experience had marked them visibly. Mabel Smith appeared nervous and exhausted, her manner suggesting someone who had not slept properly in many nights. Reverend Smith maintained better composure but conveyed a similar air of strain, of resources stretched to their limits. They welcomed Price into the house and immediately began describing their experiences, speaking over each other in their eagerness to convey the extent and variety of the phenomena they had endured. Price listened and took notes, his manner professional and calm. He asked specific questions about timing, about the witnesses to various incidents, about whether the phenomena occurred more frequently at certain times or in particular locations. He inquired about the history of the house, learned about the Bull family's long tenure, and their acceptance of the haunting as a permanent condition. The Smiths showed him through the house, pointing out the locations where phenomena occurred most frequently. The corridor on the second floor, the blue room, the main staircase, the cellars, The rectory impressed Price with its size and complexity. The house contained numerous rooms spread across multiple levels, connected by corridors and staircases that created a maze-like interior. The addition built by Reverend Bull in the 1870s had created junctions and passages where the old and new structures met, spaces that felt transitional or liminal. The cellars extended beneath much of the building, stone-floored chambers that retained the cold and damp of underground spaces. The overall atmosphere was somber, shadowed, the kind of dwelling that would feel oppressive even without supernatural associations. Price began his investigation methodically. He set up equipment in various rooms, placing thermometers to record temperature fluctuations, arranging cameras to capture images if phenomena occurred, positioning recording devices to document sounds. He interviewed the servants, taking down their testimony about footsteps, doors, objects moving, the feelings of dread in certain locations. The servants spoke frankly, perhaps emboldened by the presence of an investigator who took their accounts seriously, who did not dismiss them as superstitious or imaginative. On his first evening at the rectory, Price experienced phenomena himself. He was standing in the corridor on the second floor, the location where footsteps had been heard most frequently, when he detected the sound of someone walking in the passage ahead of him. The footsteps were distinct, measured, approaching along the corridor. Price moved toward the sound, walking quickly to confront whatever or whoever was there. But as he advanced, the footsteps receded, staying always ahead of him until they ceased entirely. The corridor before him was empty, the doors along it closed, no person visible who could have been walking there. Later that evening, as full darkness settled over the house, Price was in the drawing room with the Smiths, when they heard a loud crash from somewhere above. All three of them went to investigate, climbing the stairs to the upper floor, searching the rooms to determine what had fallen or been knocked over. They found nothing disturbed, no object out of place, no explanation for the sound they had all clearly heard. This pattern would repeat throughout Price's stay. Sounds without sources, effects without visible causes, phenomena that occurred but left no physical evidence that could be examined or measured. The phantom nun appeared during Price's second evening at the rectory. He had positioned himself on the lawn in the late afternoon, watching the area that witnesses had described as the Nun's Walk, hoping to observe the apparition himself. As twilight gathered, a figure became visible among the trees at the far end of the garden. Price observed through binoculars, saw what appeared to be a woman in dark habit moving along the path, walking with slow, steady pace. He signalled to his assistant, who was positioned at a different vantage point, and both men watched the figure progress across the lawn. Price attempted to photograph the apparition using a camera he had brought for this purpose, but the light was poor and the figure distant, and he could not be certain whether the images would capture anything useful. As the figure approached along the path, Price moved to intercept her, walking across the lawn to meet her. But as had happened to so many witnesses before him, the figure faded as he drew near. She became less substantial, more transparent, until she vanished entirely while still several yards from where Price stood. He examined the path where she had been walking, found nothing unusual, no footprints or physical trace. The experience left him certain that he had witnessed something anomalous, something that could not be easily explained as misperception or natural phenomena. Yet the encounter provided no tangible evidence he could take back to his laboratory for analysis. Price spent several days at Borley, documenting the phenomena, experiencing incidents himself, gathering testimony from everyone connected with the house. He recorded temperature drops in the blue room, measured at one point a decrease of several degrees within the space of minutes. The cold concentrated in a particular area of the chamber. He heard the footsteps repeatedly, sometimes accompanied by the sound of doors opening or closing. He witnessed objects move. A small ornament on the mantelpiece that shifted position while he watched it, no vibration or draft that could account for the movement. He experienced the sense of presence that so many reported, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, of not being alone even when no other person was near. But he could not capture the phenomena in ways that would satisfy scientific proof. His photographs revealed nothing unusual when developed. His recording devices picked up sounds but could not definitively prove they were paranormal rather than natural noises from an old house. His measurements documented anomalies but did not explain their cause. The phenomena were real. Price had no doubt of that after his experiences at the rectory, but they were elusive, resistant to the methods of documentation and measurement he had brought to bear upon them. Price interviewed local people, gathering the history and folklore surrounding the house. He heard the legend of the nun and the monk, recorded the various versions of the tale, learned about sightings that predated the rectory's construction. He spoke with people who had known the Bull family, who could testify to the long history of phenomena spanning decades before the Smiths arrived. The accumulated testimony impressed him with its consistency. The same types of phenomena reported by multiple witnesses across many years, people who had no contact with each other and no reason to coordinate their stories. This weight of testimony suggested genuine haunting rather than fraud or delusion. Price returned to London after his initial investigation with his mind full of questions and his notebooks full of documentation. He wrote an article about Borley Rectory for a journal devoted to psychical research, describing the phenomena and his experiences investigating the house. The article brought the case to wider attention within the community of paranormal investigators and researchers. Borley's Rectory became known beyond Suffolk, became a case discussed in London circles interested in supernatural phenomena, became a location that other investigators hoped to visit and study. For the Smiths, Price's investigation provided validation, but not relief. His presence and his methods had confirmed that the phenomena were real, that they were not imagining or exaggerating their experiences. But he had not ended the haunting, had not discovered any way to make the phenomena cease. The house continued its manifestations after Price departed, continued to make their lives difficult and frightening. Reverend Smith renewed his appeals to church authorities for a transfer to another parish, emphasised that the situation had become untenable, that neither he nor his wife could continue living in such conditions. The church authorities proved reluctant at first, perhaps doubting the severity of the situation, perhaps concerned about finding another rector willing to take the Borley living if the word spread about the haunting. But eventually, faced with Smith's continued insistence and perhaps influenced by the publicity Price's article had generated, they agreed to reassign him. In the autumn of 1929, less than 2 years after arriving at Borley, the Smiths departed the rectory with relief and lingering distress. Their brief tenure had been marked by fear and sleeplessness, by experiences that had challenged their understanding of reality, by the realization that some places harbour presences that resist both prayer and scientific investigation. The rectory stood empty once again, awaiting its next occupant. Harry Price maintained his interest in the case, corresponded with the people connected to Borley, hoped for an opportunity to conduct a more extended investigation if circumstances permitted. The house had impressed him profoundly, had presented phenomena more varied and persistent than most cases he had encountered. He believed Borley Rectory might prove to be one of the most significant haunted locations in England, perhaps in the world if proper investigation could be conducted over an extended period. The case had entered his professional focus, had become something he would pursue for years to come, drawn back repeatedly to the red brick house on the marshlands, where the boundaries between living and dead seemed dangerously thin. Chapter 7. The Foyster Years and Marianne's Ordeal. The summer of 1930 brought new occupants to Borley Rectory. The Reverend Lionel Algernon Foyster arrived with his wife Marianne and their young adopted daughter to take up the living that the Smiths had fled. Foyster was a cousin of the Bull family, had grown up with knowledge of the rectory and its reputation, had visited the house during his youth when the Bulls still resided there. Perhaps this familiarity gave him confidence that he could manage whatever phenomena the house produced. Perhaps he simply needed the position, the income and status that came with being rector of Borley and was willing to accept the strange conditions in exchange for those benefits. Whatever his reasoning, he moved his family into the rectory despite its history, despite warnings from those who had lived there before. Marianne Foyster was much younger than her husband, a woman in her 20s married to a man approaching 60. She had come from Canada, had met Lionel Foyster in circumstances that remained somewhat unclear, and had married him despite the significant age difference. She was attractive and vivacious, possessed of energy and personality that contrasted with her husband's more sombre clerical manner. The adopted daughter was a small child, too young to understand the house's reputation, innocent of the history that saturated the walls around her. The phenomena began immediately, more violent and aggressive than anything the Bull or Smith families had experienced. The first night in the house, Marianne was awakened by something pulling the bedclothes off her, tugging the blankets and sheets away despite her attempts to hold them. She felt hands grasping at her, invisible fingers that clutched and pulled, that seemed determined to drag her from the bed. She called out to her husband, who woke and attempted to comfort her, but the phenomena continued. Objects in the room began to move, small items flying through the air, a water jug on the washstand overturning and spilling its contents. The incidents escalated rapidly. Bottles and stones were thrown in the house, hurled with force, though no visible hand threw them. The projectiles came from various directions, sometimes from rooms where no person stood, sometimes seeming to originate from within walls or ceilings. Windows shattered, furniture overturned, bells rang constantly, the servants' bells jangling at all hours until Lionel Foyster had the wiring disconnected, but even then the bells continued to ring, operating without the physical connection that should have been necessary. Marianne became the particular focus of the phenomena. She was touched repeatedly by unseen hands, pushed, pulled, struck, on occasion hard enough to leave bruises. She reported being lifted from her feet by invisible forces, carried across rooms, deposited roughly elsewhere. Objects were thrown at her specifically, aimed with apparent accuracy and sometimes with considerable force. She found her possessions moved or hidden, her clothing disarranged, her belongings scattered through the house in ways that suggested malicious intent rather than random disturbance. Writing appeared on the walls, messages scrawled in pencil or crayon, or what appeared to be charcoal, found throughout the house, but particularly in areas Marianne frequented. The writing was crude, the spelling poor, the grammar awkward, but the content was clearly directed at her. The messages pleaded for help, for prayers, for mass to be said. Some appeared to be signed with names, Marianne herself, or other names that might belong to the entities producing the phenomena. The messages suggested intelligence, purpose, and attempt at communication, however clumsy and disturbing. One message read, "Marianne, please help get." Another said, "Marianne, light mass prayers." The incomplete sentences and strange phrasing suggested either an uneducated writer or something struggling to communicate across a barrier that made expression difficult. The appearance of Marianne's own name in the messages was particularly unsettling, implying that whatever wrote them knew her, had singled her out, demanded something from her specifically. Lionel Foyster documented the phenomena in a diary, recording hundreds of incidents during the 5 years the family lived at Borley. His entries described the violence and frequency of the occurrences, noted the toll they took on the household, recorded his attempts to address them through prayer and religious ritual. He performed exorcisms, read prayers of protection, blessed the house repeatedly. The phenomena continued regardless, sometimes seeming to intensify in response to religious intervention. The adopted daughter witnessed many of the incidents, experienced phenomena herself. She saw objects move and fly through the air, heard the footsteps and door sounds that had troubled previous residents, encountered the oppressive atmosphere that pervaded certain rooms. For a child to grow up in such circumstances must have been deeply disturbing, must have shaped her understanding of the world in ways that differed profoundly from normal childhood experience. Servants came and went rapidly. Few stayed long at the rectory, most finding the conditions intolerable, frightened by the phenomena or struck by projectiles or simply unable to continue working in such an atmosphere. The turnover created difficulties for running the household, left Marianne to manage much of the domestic work herself, added to the strain of living with the constant haunting. Harry Price maintained contact with the Foysters, corresponded with Lionel about the phenomena, received reports of the incidents as they occurred. Price visited the rectory again during the Foyster years, witnessed some of the phenomena himself, examined the writing on the walls, interviewed family members and servants. He recognised that the haunting had intensified significantly, that whatever forces operated in the house had become more aggressive and more focused on Marianne specifically. Price began to suspect that Marianne herself might be what researchers termed a poltergeist focus, a person whose presence or psychological state somehow catalysed or intensified paranormal phenomena. This theory suggested that the haunting was not entirely independent of the living occupants, but rather drew power or manifestation ability from particular individuals. Marianne's youth, her unusual circumstances, perhaps tensions in her marriage to a much older man, might have created conditions that allowed the phenomena to manifest more powerfully. But this theory could not account for all the phenomena. The rectory had been haunted for decades before Marianne arrived, had produced consistent types of manifestations for multiple families across many years. The phenomena during the Foyster years were more violent and more frequent, but they were not entirely different in character from what had been reported before. The footsteps continued, the apparitions appeared, the phantom nun walked her path through the gardens. These manifestations predated Marianne and would presumably continue after she left, suggesting they were independent of her presence, even if her presence somehow amplified them. The wall writing became a subject of particular controversy. Skeptics suggested Marianne herself wrote the messages, that she created the phenomena either consciously as fraud or unconsciously through some psychological disturbance. The poor spelling and awkward phrasing in the messages seemed inconsistent with Marianne's education level, and she vehemently denied writing them. But no definitive proof existed either way. The messages appeared when she was alone or when no one was specifically watching the walls, making it impossible to completely rule out the possibility that she had produced them herself. Other incidents seemed impossible to attribute to Marianne. Objects thrown when she was in different rooms, witnessed by multiple people. The bell ringing that occurred throughout the house simultaneously. The apparitions seen by people who had no connection to Marianne, who observed them independently. The long history of phenomena predating her arrival. The weight of evidence suggested something more than fraud or psychological disturbance, even if her presence did somehow intensify the manifestations. The Foyster family endured 5 years at Borley from 1930 to 1935. 5 years of violence and fear, of sleepless nights and days spent dealing with phenomena that made normal life nearly impossible. Lionel Foyster's health declined during this period, the stress and constant disturbance taking their toll on a man already in his 60s. Marianne's nerves were stretched to breaking, her resources exhausted by the relentless assault of phenomena directed particularly at her. In 1935, the Foysters finally departed. Lionel Foyster accepted a position elsewhere, leaving Borley and its haunted rectory behind. They took with them memories of 5 years lived in conditions that most people would find unbearable, 5 years that had tested their faith and their sanity, 5 years that had made them participants in what was increasingly recognised as one of the most intense hauntings ever documented in England. The rectory stood empty once more after their departure. The church authorities made no immediate effort to find another rector for Borley. The house had defeated 3 families now, had driven away occupants through phenomena that seemed immune to prayer or exorcism or any attempt at resolution. The building's reputation had spread, had become known throughout England and beyond through Price's writings and the accounts of those who had lived there. Few clergymen would willingly accept the living at Borley, would choose to subject their families to what the Bulls and Smiths and Foysters had endured. Harry Price saw opportunity in the vacancy. An empty house, available for extended investigation without the complications of residents who needed to maintain normal domestic life. A location where phenomena had been extensively documented, where multiple witnesses over many years had reported consistent types of manifestations. If the church authorities could be persuaded to grant access, Price could conduct the kind of systematic long-term investigation that might finally yield definitive evidence about the nature of hauntings, about whether consciousness survived death, about the questions that had driven his research for decades. Price approached the church authorities with a proposal. He would rent the rectory, would take responsibility for its maintenance, would conduct a proper scientific investigation over an extended period. He would recruit observers, establish protocols, document everything that occurred. The investigation would be rigorous, would follow scientific methods, would produce evidence that might finally settle questions about the paranormal that had remained speculative and controversial. The church authorities agreed. Perhaps they were relieved to have someone willing to occupy the property and pay for the privilege. Perhaps they hoped Price's investigation might somehow resolve the haunting, might make the rectory habitable again for future clergy. Whatever their reasoning, they granted Price a lease on Borley Rectory beginning in May of 1937. Price recruited volunteers to serve as observers, placing advertisements seeking people willing to spend time in the rectory documenting phenomena. Dozens responded, drawn by curiosity or genuine interest in paranormal research. Price selected the most suitable candidates, established procedures for their stays at the house, provided them with notebooks and instructions for recording any incidents they experienced. The investigation would continue for several years, producing volumes of documentation, experiences both profound and ambiguous, evidence that would be debated and analysed for decades to come. Borley Rectory had entered a new phase of its history, no longer simply a haunted house where unfortunate families struggled to live, but a laboratory for paranormal research, a location where the questions about life and death and consciousness that had troubled humanity for millennia might finally find some answers. Chapter 8. The Séances and Spirit Communications. Harry Price took possession of Borley Rectory in the spring of 1937, arriving with equipment and determination to conduct the most thorough paranormal investigation yet attempted in England. The house stood as it had for decades, red brick and Gothic windows, surrounded by overgrown gardens and the trees that lined the nuns' walk. Empty of human occupants for nearly 2 years, the building had settled into itself, its rooms silent except for whatever sounds emanated from sources beyond the living world. Price established his base of operations, arranged his instruments and recording devices, prepared to document whatever the house might reveal during the months and years of investigation that lay ahead. The volunteers began arriving in the summer of that year, individuals who had responded to Price's advertisement seeking observers willing to spend periods of time alone or in small groups within the rectory. They came from various backgrounds. Some were members of organisations devoted to psychical research. Others were simply curious individuals drawn by the house's reputation. A few were skeptics hoping to debunk the claims of haunting through rational observation. Price screened them carefully, selected those who seemed most reliable and least likely to fabricate evidence, provided them with detailed instructions about what to observe and how to document their experiences. Each observer received a notebook and specific guidelines. They were to record the date and time of any unusual occurrence, describe it in detail, note whether other witnesses were present, attempt to rule out natural explanations before attributing phenomena to supernatural causes. Price wanted documentation that would withstand scientific scrutiny, accounts detailed enough to be analysed and evaluated by other researchers. The observers stayed in the house for periods ranging from a single night to several weeks, rotating through so that the rectory remained under observation continuously. The phenomena continued during Price's tenure, manifesting with the same variety and persistence that had marked the decades of private occupation. Observers reported the familiar footsteps in empty corridors, doors opening and closing without visible cause, temperature drops in specific locations, objects moving or disappearing. Some witnessed apparitions, the phantom nun continuing her walks through the garden, shadowy figures glimpsed in doorways or passing through rooms, forms that vanished when directly confronted. The house maintained its character as a location where the boundary between natural and supernatural seemed dangerously thin. But Price sought more than passive observation. He wanted to attempt communication with whatever entities inhabited the rectory, to move beyond merely documenting phenomena toward actual interaction with the presences responsible for the haunting. To this end, he organised séances, sessions where mediums would attempt to contact the spirits believed to dwell in the house, to gather information about their identities and purposes, perhaps to discover what might release them from their earthly binding. The first séance was conducted in the autumn of 1937. Price invited a medium named Helen Glanville, a woman who claimed abilities in spirit communication, who had participated in previous investigations and produced results that Price found intriguing if not entirely convincing. Glanville came to Borley accompanied by her daughter, also reported to possess mediumistic abilities, and several other participants who would serve as witnesses and record keepers. They gathered in the drawing room as evening settled over the marshlands. The room was prepared according to the practices common to séances of that era. Curtains drawn, a single lamp providing dim light, participants seated around a table with hands joined to form what spiritualists termed a circle. The atmosphere was solemn, expectant, charged with the anticipation that comes when people deliberately seek contact with realms beyond ordinary perception. Helen Glanville entered a trance state, or claimed to do so, her breathing changing, her posture shifting, her voice when she spoke taking on different qualities than her normal speech. She began to relay messages, claiming they came from spirits present in the room, entities that wished to communicate with the living participants. The messages were fragmentary at first, incomplete sentences, names that might belong to the deceased, vague references to events or locations that could not be immediately verified. But as the séance progressed, more specific information emerged. Glanville spoke of a nun, a young woman who had lived centuries ago, who had been murdered and buried in the grounds of the monastery that once stood where the rectory now rose. The spirit claimed her name was Marie Lair, that she had come from France, that she had been killed by a man named Waldegrave sometime in the year 1767. The details were oddly specific, particularly the date, which fell more than a century after the dissolution when the monastery would have long been demolished. The séance participants questioned the spirit through Glanville, asking for clarification, for evidence that might verify the claims. The entity speaking through the medium insisted that remains lay buried beneath the house, that prayers and proper burial were needed to release the spirit from its earthly wandering. The messages conveyed desperation, pleading, a sense of being trapped in circumstances that prevented the soul from moving to whatever realm awaited after death. Other spirits supposedly manifested during the séance. A man who identified himself as Harry Bull, the previous rector who had died in 1927, spoke briefly through the medium. Another entity claimed to be a servant who had died in the house years earlier. The messages overlapped and contradicted each other at times, creating confusion about which spirit was speaking and what information could be trusted. Price recorded the séance carefully, taking notes throughout, attempting to separate verifiable facts from vague claims and theatrical presentation. He was aware that mediums sometimes used techniques of cold reading or gathered information beforehand to make their communication seem more authentic. But certain details interested him. The specific date given for the nun's death, the name Waldegrave, the insistence about remains being buried on the property. These were claims that could potentially be investigated, that might yield evidence supporting or refuting the supernatural explanation. A second séance was conducted several months later, in March of 1938. This session produced more dramatic results. Through the medium, a spirit claiming to be a previous occupant of the monastery made a startling prediction. The entity stated that Borley Rectory would be destroyed by fire, that the destruction would occur that very night over the building. The message was recorded by all participants, noted in the official documentation of the séance, preserved as the testable prophecy that time would either confirm or refute. The prediction specified not only that fire would come, but offered details about what would be found afterward. The spirit claimed that when the ruins were excavated, bones would be discovered beneath the structure, the remains of a murdered woman who'd been buried in unhallowed ground centuries before. These remains would prove the truth of the haunting, would explain why the location had been troubled for so long, would provide the evidence needed to understand the nature of the phenomena. March of 1938 passed without fire. The rectory stood intact, undamaged, its bricks and timbers showing no sign of the predicted destruction. Skeptics seized upon this failed prophecy as evidence that the séances were fraudulent or at least unreliable, that whatever information came through mediums could not be trusted. But Price noted carefully that the spirit had not specified 1938, had said the fire would come in March but had not indicated which year. The prediction remained theoretically possible, though its vagueness made it difficult to evaluate. Additional séances were conducted over the following months, producing more messages and claims from entities purporting to be spirits connected with the house. The communications remained frustratingly inconsistent, offering details that sometimes aligned with historical records and sometimes contradicted them, making predictions that were either too vague to verify or specific but failed to materialize. The séances generated extensive documentation, but little that could definitively prove or disprove the survival of consciousness after death. Price attempted to verify the historical claims made during the séances. He researched the name Waldegrave, found that a family of that name had owned property in Suffolk during the 18th century, but could not confirm any connection to Borley or to a French nun named Marie Lair. He searched records for evidence of a Marie Lair, found no definitive proof of her existence, though the incompleteness of historical records from that era made absence of evidence inconclusive. The date 1767 fell long after the monastery period, making the story of a nun being present and murdered at that time questionable, unless she had been living in a private residence rather than a convent. The investigation continued through 1938 and into 39. The volunteer. Observers rotated through the rectory, spending their nights in the house documenting the phenomena that continued to manifest. The accounts accumulated, hundreds of incidents recorded, experiences described by dozens of different witnesses, patterns emerging that suggested consistent types of haunting regardless of who observed them. But the definitive evidence Price sought remained elusive. The phenomena were real enough to convince most observers that something unusual occurred at Borley, but they resisted the kind of documentation that would satisfy scientific proof. The house began to deteriorate during Price's occupancy. Without regular maintenance, without fires lit to dry the damp that rose from the marshlands, the building suffered. Plaster cracked, wallpaper peeled, floors warped from moisture. The rectory took on an increasingly derelict appearance, looking more like a ruin than a functioning dwelling. This decay added to the atmosphere of desolation, made the house feel even more like a place abandoned by the living, claimed by forces that did not require comfort or preservation. In February of 1939, Price's lease on the property expired. The church authorities did not renew it, perhaps dissatisfied with the publicity the investigation had generated, perhaps concerned about the house's deteriorating condition. Price vacated the rectory, removed his equipment and documentation, ended the period of systematic investigation that had occupied nearly 2 years. He left behind a building that had yielded much testimony and many experiences, but few definitive answers, a place that remained as mysterious at the end of his investigation as it had been at the beginning. A new occupant took possession of Borley Rectory in the spring of that year. Captain William Hart Gregson purchased the property, intending to renovate it for use as a private residence. Gregson was not particularly interested in the paranormal, viewed the haunting strees with skepticism, believed that the house's reputation had been exaggerated by Price and others for publicity purposes. He planned to restore the building, to make it comfortable and habitable, to prove that Borley was simply an old house with natural quirks rather than a genuinely haunted location. Gregson moved into the rectory with his belongings and his plans for renovation. He dismissed the supernatural claims, attributed the phenomena reported by previous occupants to imagination or fraud, or the normal sounds and movements of an aging structure. He would live there peacefully. He assured people who questioned his decision would suffer none of the disturbances that had troubled the Bulls and Smiths and Foysters. The house would be restored to respectability, its reputation as a haunted dwelling laid to rest through rational occupation and practical maintenance. But on the night of February 27, 1939, 11 months after the séance, prediction had been recorded. Fire broke out in Borley Rectory. Captain Gregson was in the hallway when an oil lamp overturned, or fell, or was knocked by some unseen force. Accounts varied about exactly what happened. The spilled oil ignited immediately, flames spreading across the floor and catching on the old dry wood of the rectory's construction. Gregson attempted to fight the fire, but it spread too rapidly, fed by decades of accumulated dust and the timber that had dried through months without heating. The rectory burned through the night. The local fire brigade responded, but could do little to save the structure. The water pressure was insufficient, the building too large and too far gone by the time they arrived. The flames consumed the interior, gutted the rooms where so many phenomena had been witnessed, destroyed the corridors where phantom footsteps had echoed for decades. The roof collapsed, the floors gave way, the walls remained standing but hollowed, emptied of everything that had made them a dwelling. By dawn, Borley Rectory existed only as ruins. The brick walls stood in places, blackened by smoke supporting nothing. The windows gaped empty, their glass shattered by heat. The interior was destroyed completely, reduced to ash and charred timbers and the remnants of a structure that had stood for 76 years. The house that had been called the most haunted dwelling in England was gone, consumed by the fire that a spirit in a séance had predicted almost exactly a year before. Chapter 9. The Fire and the Excavation. The morning after the fire revealed the extent of the destruction. Borley Rectory stood as a shell, its walls rising from the foundation like broken teeth, blackened and hollow. The roof had collapsed entirely, the timbers that had supported it now reduced to charred fragments scattered through the ruins. The floors had given way, falling into the cellars below, creating caverns of ash and debris where rooms had once existed. The Gothic windows stared empty across the marshlands, their frames twisted by heat, their glass melted or shattered. What had been a substantial Victorian dwelling was now a ruin, joining the monastery that had stood on these grounds centuries before in the category of structures that existed only as remnants and memory. Captain Gregson had escaped the fire with minor injuries, had stood watching as the flames consumed the building he had purchased only months earlier, with plans for renovation and comfortable residence. His skepticism about the haunting had not survived the experience. Whether the lamp had fallen by accident or been overturned by something unseen, whether the fire was natural misfortune or the fulfillment of supernatural prophecy, Gregson could not say with certainty. But the timing troubled him. A fire occurring in February, almost exactly when the séance prediction had indicated, destroying the house as the spirit message had foretold. The coincidence was difficult to dismiss, even for someone who had approached the supernatural with rationalist convictions. Harry Price learned of the fire within days, received reports from contacts in Suffolk who knew of his interest in Borley. The news must have struck him with mixed emotions. Dismay at the loss of a location that had provided such extensive research opportunities, but also a kind of grim satisfaction that the séance prediction had been fulfilled, albeit a year later than initially expected. The fire validated aspects of the investigation, suggested that the communications received through mediums had contained genuine information rather than mere theatrical fabrication. It transformed the prediction from failed prophecy to documented precognition, though the year's delay complicated claims of precision. Price travelled to Borley to examine the ruins. He walked through the shell of the building, navigated carefully around areas where walls might collapse or floors give way, observed the devastation that fire brings to structures built of wood and brick. The cellars remained partially accessible, though filled with debris from the collapsed floors above. The foundations were visible now, exposed by the destruction of everything that had risen from them. The site had become an archaeological opportunity, a chance to examine the ground beneath the house, to search for the remains that séance communications had insisted lay buried somewhere on the property. The prediction had been specific on this point. When the house burned and excavations were conducted in the ruins, bones would be found, the skeletal remains of a murdered woman, a nun named Marie Lair according to the spirit messages, killed in 1767 and buried in unhallowed ground. These remains would prove the supernatural nature of the haunting, would explain why the location had been troubled for so long, would provide physical evidence that consciousness survived death and could communicate across the boundary between worlds. Price organised an excavation in August of 1943, 4 years after the fire. The delay was due partly to the outbreak of war in Europe, which made such investigations seem frivolous when the nation faced existential threats, and partly to the time required to gain permission for excavation on property that no longer belonged to him. But Price maintained his interest through the war years, corresponded with those who had ownership or authority over the ruins, eventually secured approval to conduct a limited archaeological investigation. The excavation focused on the cellars and the area beneath what had been the main structure of the house. Workers cleared debris, removed layers of ash and charred wood and collapsed masonry, dug carefully through the earth beneath the old foundations. The work was painstaking, conducted with attention to preserving any artifacts or remains that might be discovered, documented through photographs and detailed notes of what was found at each level of excavation. On August 17, 1943, the excavators made a discovery. Beneath the flagstones in what had been the cellar, buried in the earth approximately 3 feet below the surface, they found human bones. The remains were incomplete: a jawbone, pieces of skull, other skeletal fragments, but clearly human, clearly old, clearly buried deliberately, rather than interred in any recognised cemetery. The bones lay in an area that would have been beneath the oldest part of the house, perhaps corresponding to the location of the medieval monastery that legend claimed had once stood on the site. Price arranged for the bones to be examined by experts, sent them to specialists who could determine age, sex, and any other information the remains might reveal. The analysis confirmed the bones were human, belonged to a young adult female, had been in the ground for a considerable period, though precise dating proved difficult with the methods available in the 1940s. The remains suggested someone who had died and been buried in a location not designated for proper burial, someone whose bones had lain beneath the rectory throughout all the decades of haunting. The discovery seemed to validate the séance predictions. A fire had destroyed the house as foretold. Excavations in the ruins had revealed human remains as promised. A young woman had indeed been buried beneath the structure, hidden in earth that the living had walked upon for centuries without knowing what lay below. The correlation between prediction and discovery impressed even skeptics, suggested that the communications received during séances had contained genuine information obtained through means beyond normal perception. But questions remained. The bones could not be definitively linked to anyone named Marie Lair. No historical records confirmed such a person had lived or died in the area during 1767. The remains might be much older, might date to the monastery period or even earlier, might belong to someone whose death and burial had nothing to do with the legend surrounding Borley. The discovery proved that bones lay beneath the house, but it did not prove the specific story told through the medium during the séances. Price arranged for the bones to be given proper burial. A service was conducted, the remains interred in the churchyard at Liston, a village near Borley. The burial followed Christian rites, blessing bones that had lain in unhallowed ground for an unknown period, granting them the recognition and respect that had been denied in whatever circumstances had led to their original burial beneath the monastery or rectory foundations. Whether this act brought peace to whatever spirit might have been bound to the site, whether it fulfilled the purpose that séance communications had indicated was needed, remained unknowable. The ruins of Borley Rectory stood for years after the fire, gradually deteriorating as weather and vegetation worked to reclaim the site. The brick walls crumbled, fell in sections, were cannibalized by local people who took materials for their own building projects. The foundations became overgrown with weeds and small trees, nature slowly erasing the evidence that a house had stood there. By the 1950s, little remained visible above ground: scattered bricks, fragments of wall, the general outline of where the structure had been. The site retained its reputation despite the physical destruction of the house. People continued to visit the location, drawn by its history and the stories that had accumulated around it. Some reported experiencing phenomena even in the ruins, seeing apparitions among the broken walls, hearing sounds that had no natural source, feeling presences in the overgrown garden where the phantom nun had walked for centuries. Whether these experiences reflected genuine supernatural activity or the power of suggestion and expectation, whether the haunting survived the destruction of the physical structure that had sheltered it, remained subjects of debate. Price published a comprehensive book about Borley Rectory in 1940 titled The Most Haunted House in England. The volume presented the history of the site, the testimony of witnesses across multiple decades, the documentation from his own investigations, the séance communications and their apparent fulfillment through the fire and excavation. The book brought the case to wide public attention, established Borley as perhaps the most famous haunted location in England, cemented Price's reputation as a serious paranormal investigator. But it also drew criticism from skeptics who questioned his methods, suggested he had exaggerated phenomena, or failed to adequately rule out natural explanations, accused him of seeking publicity rather than genuine scientific truth. The controversy that surrounded Price's work intensified after his death in 1948. Critics examined his records more carefully, found inconsistencies in accounts, questioned whether all the phenomena he reported had actually occurred as described. Some suggested that Price himself had staged certain incidents, had created phenomena to make the investigation seem more productive than it actually was. These accusations damaged his reputation, made the Borley case more questionable in the eyes of researchers who demanded rigorous standards of evidence. But the core testimony remained. The Bull family's decades of experiences, documented in letters and diaries long before Price became involved. The Smiths' desperate plea for help, the Foysters' 5 years of violent phenomena, the volunteer observers who reported incidents during Price's investigation, the bones found in the ruins after the fire that had been predicted in a séance, the accumulated weight of testimony spanning nearly 80 years, involving hundreds of witnesses describing consistent types of phenomena, regardless of who observed them. Borley Rectory was gone, reduced to fragments and memories, but the questions it raised endured. What had caused the phenomena that so many credible witnesses reported? Why had that particular location proven so troubled for so long? What was the relationship between the medieval legends, the bones found in excavation, and the haunting that persisted through decades of documented history? Had consciousness survived death in forms that could interact with the living world? Or were all the phenomena explainable through psychology, fraud, and misperception? The ruins offered no answers, only the fact of their existence, the testimony of destruction, the bones that had lain beneath, waiting to be discovered. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Borley. The story of Borley Rectory did not end with fire and ruins. The house was gone, reduced to rubble and memory, but its reputation endured, grew, became woven into the folklore and popular consciousness of England and beyond. In the decades following the fire, Borley became synonymous with haunting, became the standard against which other supposedly supernatural locations were measured, became a case study in the difficulties of investigating paranormal claims, and the questions that arise when testimony and evidence refuse to align neatly. Harry Price's book established the narrative that would dominate discussions of Borley for generations. The most haunted house in England presented the case in dramatic terms, compiled the testimony of multiple families across decades, described the investigations Price had conducted, detailed the séance predictions and their apparent fulfillment. The book was popular, readable, compelling in its presentation of phenomena that challenged materialist assumptions about reality. It convinced many readers that Borley represented genuine supernatural activity. that the accumulated evidence proved consciousness survived death and could manifest in ways perceivable to the living. But Price's death in 1948 opened the way for critical reassessment. Other researchers, particularly members of the Society for Psychical Research, began examining his records more carefully, comparing accounts from different sources, looking for inconsistencies or indications of fraud. They found problems. Some testimony reported in Price's books did not match the original witness statements. Incidents that Price described as well documented were actually reported by only single witnesses whose credibility was questionable. Certain phenomena that seemed most dramatic may have been exaggerated or fabricated to make the case more compelling. Critics pointed particularly to incidents during Price's own investigation. Objects that allegedly moved or were thrown when only Price or his close associates were present. Phenomena that occurred with suspicious frequency when Price was conducting his research, but less often when independent observers were watching. The possibility emerged that Price had staged some incidents, had created phenomena through trickery to ensure his investigation produced results that justified his investment of time and resources. The wall writing from the Foyster years came under special scrutiny. Analysis of the handwriting suggested it might have been produced by Marianne Foyster herself, that the messages pleading for help and prayers might have been her own creation rather than supernatural communication. Whether she wrote them consciously as fraud or unconsciously in some disturbed psychological state remained debated, but the possibility that natural explanation existed for at least some phenomena weakened claims that everything at Borley was genuinely paranormal. Yet complete debunking proved as difficult as complete validation. Too much testimony existed from too many sources, spanning too many years to dismiss the entire case as fraud or delusion. The Bull family's experiences predated any involvement by Price, were documented in private correspondence and diaries that had no motive for fabrication. The Smiths had fled the house in genuine distress, had sought help because their situation had become unbearable. Visitors and servants who had no connection to the families or to Price reported phenomena that matched the established patterns. The phantom nun was seen by dozens of witnesses across decades, including skeptical observers who had no prior belief in ghosts. The bones discovered in the ruins after the fire remained physical evidence that something lay buried beneath the house, something the séance communications had indicated would be found. Whether these remains belonged to Marie Lair, whether they had any connection to the haunting, could not be proven. But their existence confirmed that part of the séance prediction suggested that information obtained during those sessions had contained genuine elements, however mixed with error or theatrical embellishment. Researchers attempted to find middle ground between complete belief and total skepticism. Perhaps some phenomena at Borley were genuine, while others were exaggerated or fabricated. Perhaps the house had experienced real haunting, but Price had supplemented it with staged incidents to ensure his investigation seemed successful. Perhaps psychological factors played roles alongside supernatural ones, with the expectations and fears of residents influencing what they perceived and how they interpreted ambiguous experiences. Perhaps different explanations applied to different phenomena, natural causes for some incidents, fraud for others, genuine supernatural activity for a residual core that resisted rational explanation. The site itself continued to draw interest long after the ruins had been cleared. The land where the rectory stood was eventually sold, divided, built upon. Modern houses rose on ground that had been walked by phantom nuns and troubled families, but reports of phenomena continued sporadically. Residents in houses built near the old rectory site claimed to hear footsteps, to see figures in gardens, to experience cold spots and feelings of presence. Whether these represented continuation of the haunting, whether the phenomena had survived the destruction of the physical structure that had sheltered them, remained unclear. Paranormal investigators continued to visit the area, conducted their own studies, sought evidence that might settle questions Price's work had raised but not resolved. Some reported experiencing phenomena, cold spots measured with thermometers, electromagnetic anomalies detected with modern equipment, photographs that captured unusual lights or shapes. Others found nothing, conducted investigations that yielded no evidence of supernatural activity, concluded that whatever had once made Borley notorious had ceased with the fire, or perhaps had never been genuinely supernatural at all. The debate about Borley became emblematic of larger controversies about paranormal research. How should testimony be weighted when evaluating supernatural claims? What constitutes sufficient evidence to overcome the presumption that phenomena have natural explanations? How do investigators guard against fraud, delusion, and their own biases, while remaining open to possibilities that challenge conventional understanding? Can subjective experiences, feelings of presence, perceptions of figures, reactions of fear or unease, ever serve as valid evidence for claims about objective reality? These questions had no easy answers. Science demanded replicability, controlled conditions, measurements that could be verified independently. But paranormal phenomena, if they existed, seemed to resist such conditions, to manifest spontaneously and inconsistently, to interact with subjective human perception in ways that made objective documentation difficult or impossible. The gap between the standards of scientific proof and the nature of reported paranormal experiences meant that cases like Borley would always remain controversial, would always occupy uncertain ground between belief and skepticism. The cultural impact of Borley exceeded its value as evidence for or against survival after death. The rectory became part of English folklore, joined the pantheon of haunted locations that included the Tower of London, Hampton Court, the many castles and manor houses where ghosts reportedly walked. The story was retold in books and articles, adapted for radio and television, became a touchstone for discussions of the supernatural. The phrase "the most haunted house in England" entered common usage, became shorthand for a location where phenomena were frequent, varied and well documented, regardless of whether they were genuinely supernatural. For believers in the paranormal, Borley represented validation. Here was a case with decades of testimony, multiple families reporting, consistent phenomena, investigations by serious researchers, even a prediction that had been fulfilled through fire and the discovery of human remains. If any location could be considered genuinely haunted, surely Borley qualified. The case suggested that consciousness did survive death, that some quality of human existence persisted beyond bodily cessation, that the dead could interact with the living under certain conditions. For skeptics, Borley represented the problems inherent in paranormal investigation. The mixture of potentially genuine phenomena with probable fraud and exaggeration, the unreliability of testimony, the way expectations and fears shaped perception, the ease with which old houses produced sounds and effects that seemed mysterious to occupants unfamiliar with their quirks, the possibility that Price had manipulated evidence to support conclusions he wanted to reach. The case demonstrated how difficult it was to establish supernatural claims with rigor, how easy it was for belief to outrun evidence. The truth about Borley Rectory, if such a thing could be determined with confidence, likely lay somewhere between these extremes. Probably some genuine mysteries existed in the house's history, phenomena that could not be easily explained by natural causes, experiences that multiple credible witnesses reported independently, patterns that emerged across decades in ways that suggested something unusual about the location. But probably fraud and exaggeration played roles as well, whether conscious deception or unconscious elaboration of ambiguous experiences into certainties they did not warrant. And probably much of what happened at Borley had mundane explanations that escaped the people who lived there, because old houses are inherently strange places, full of sounds and movements and atmospheres that can seem supernatural to people predisposed to interpret them that way. The bones buried beneath the rectory remained the most tangible legacy of the haunting. Whoever the young woman had been, whatever circumstances had led to her burial in unhallowed ground, she had lain beneath the foundations for centuries while families lived above her, while footsteps echoed in corridors, while the phantom nun walked her endless path through the garden. Her remains had been blessed and properly interred in 1943, given the recognition and respect that circumstances had denied her in life or death. Whether her spirit had been bound to the site by the violence or injustice of her end, whether proper burial had released her, whether she had any connection to the phenomena at all, would never be known with certainty. The land where Borley Rectory stood carries its history still, though visible evidence has largely vanished. The church that the rectors served remains in the village, Gothic and ancient, tended by clergy who have no residence nearby, no rectory attached to their position. The churchyard holds graves that span centuries, includes the marker for Harry Bull, who died in 1927 after decades in the haunted house. The lane that runs past the old rectory site carries traffic, as it always has, connecting the village to the wider world beyond the marshlands. Sometimes at twilight, if one stands where the lawn once spread toward the trees, imagination makes it easy to see a figure in dark habit walking slowly across the grounds. Easy to hear footsteps on floorboards that no longer exist, to sense the presence of all those who lived within walls now reduced to fragments and foundations. Easy to understand why people believed, why they told stories, why they insisted that something dwelt there that transcended material explanation. Whether those beliefs reflected genuine supernatural activity or the human tendency to populate darkness with meaning, the story of Borley Rectory endures. It remains a testament to the persistent questions about consciousness and death, about the nature of reality, and the limits of understanding about what remains when the living depart and only ruins and memory mark where they once dwelled. The candles have long since burned low, the chambers have fallen to silence, and history, as it always does, has turned the page into darkness where questions persist without answers, where belief and skepticism stand opposed without resolution, where the mystery remains mystery still.